So we're getting to a point now where we're happy with how the model's shaping up, we're happy with the scene, how the environment's going, etc. We can continue to work on these and tweak them as much as we like, right up until the point where we produce our final render. But for now, we're going to turn our attention to lighting this scene and getting it pretty much to the stage where we're ready to output our render passes and take it into our painting package, Photoshop, whatever you choose to use, and start playing around with compositing the final render. So we have our model. As you can see, I've added in some basic clouds in the background. The idea for these is they'll be blurred, out of focus. So in the renders that I'm going to show you now, they'll be quite sharp, but we have to think ahead and think, right, even though they're sharp in this, we'll ignore them for now and we'll look ahead to how they're going to be in the final render. So let's just render the scene that we have now with just the default lighting, nothing fancy, and just with the shaders that we have been using all along. So this is just a quick render. I've added in a gradient in the background just so we have some colour there rather than the default grey. Again, this is just to give us more of an idea of how the overall scene is going to look, and just so we can check also how the colours of her dress, of her hair, etc. balance out with the colours in the background. Again, we can change the background later. This is just to give us an overall idea. So here we have the default lighting. Everything's looking a bit flat, a bit plasticky, very basic really. So we need to initially think about adding in a key light and giving this some shadows, which will also give depth to the scene, and it will plant a lot of these elements. So giving her shadows underneath her, for example, will sit her more on the rocks, whereas at the moment she could be just floating above them. And the same with the hair, we need some shadows coming from her hair onto her face. So if I have another scene set up already, I'll just open this scene. You'll have this as well. Don't want to save that. So here, just close this down, you'll see I've created one main light source. Now you could go down the route of the traditional 3 lights. Your key light, which casts the main light, a backlight which just lights, gives a nice strong light to the back of the model and gives that sort of rim lighting effect, and then a fill light which just fills in those darker areas with a more subtle tone. But for this I'm just using one light, and that's the main light that's going to cast the shadows that we want. Again, I'm going to do another render, but what I'll do is we'll keep this one, and I'm just going to pause the video because this may take a little bit longer to render. So that's the render done with the main key light, and as you can see we've got some nice shadows being cast by everything. Now you can adjust the position of this light obviously to however you feel, but if we compare that with the default light which we saw before, as you can see we've added a lot more depth to the scene, and everything has just got that little bit more, looks that little bit more 3D, and the shadows just bring everything together as well. Now I've opted for a ray traced shadows just to make them a bit more precise, to be honest. If I flick between the two here, you can just see how much it's added to the scene. But we can go further than this. Obviously we've got no backlighting yet, but I'll come to that in a moment. What we also want to add is a bit more lighting depth to the scene, and we can get that by using an ambient occlusion pass. Now what this will do is it will calculate, you set the background colour for your camera, and it basically, off that colour, it calculates sort of an ambient lighting. So as if the light was cast from above, you would get some natural shadows around everything as well as this hard shadow we've got from the light. The ambient occlusion will give us softer shadows and a more ambient shadow effectively. So again, I've got another scene set up. I'll just open this. So from here, it just looks exactly the same. We've got our key lighting as well. I've also added in a floor plane, and what this will do is it will add a bit more depth to our shadows, because the lights will be calculated from above and the photons will bounce off this floor plane here and back up to the model, telling it that this area under here needs to be in shadow because there's something underneath it. So again, I will pause the video while I render this, and then we can compare with what we had before. So this is render number 3. Now this has the main key light, which is giving us the main shadows, and a bit of ambient occlusion as well. And what I've done is I've made the ambient occlusion background colour just a pale blue to give us that sort of sky sort of colour. And as you can see, it's brightened up the scene overall, and it's only given us a subtle hint of the ambient occlusion. What we're going to do later is we will render out just a complete ambient occlusion pass, and then we can overlay that in Photoshop and play around with which areas are darker, which areas are lighter, etc. And it'll give the scene a lot more contrast and depth. Again, if I compare it with the one previously, remember this is just our key light, and I think the intensity of this light was only set to about 0.5 anyway. And to be honest, that's because I played around with it with the ambient occlusion, because the key light, if it's set to 1 and you have ambient occlusion as well, it could blow out the image. So I probably, in fact I did, I reduced the intensity of the key light in this scene to compensate. But like I say, you can see adding that ambient occlusion in with a hint of blue has just brightened up the scene, giving us a little bit of depth and contrast to it as well. So where can we go from here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a backlight in the scene, and this is because I like to approach this in a different way. I like to put in a sort of fake rim lighting onto my shaders, and what this does is it gives you a lot more control over the colour of your backlighting and of how much backlighting or rim lighting you want per object or per shader. Whereas if we add a light in the background, that will affect all the objects the same and render them all exactly the same with the same amount, the same colour, etc. So again, I have a scene already set up, rim lighting here, just load that in. If I close this down, so you'll notice immediately that the model looks different, and that's because we have these ramp shaders on each model now, which helps us with the rim lighting. You'll have to excuse me, I'm trying not to go into specifics about how the rim lighting's set up in case you're not using Maya and you're using Softimage or 3ds Max or whatever. It's basically works off a facing ratio node, so which is piped into the shader via a ramp. So for the skin, for example, let me just show you actually. Rendering editors, hypershade. Now, like I say, you'll have to try and work this into different applications. So here's our skin shader. As you can see here, we have the ramp, which affects the rim, and it's only affecting the outer rim of the actual object. If I just graph that up, so what we have here is a facing ratio node, and what that does is whatever the camera is looking at, it works out sort of the edges of the model. So no matter where the camera is, this rim will always be around the edge of the model, and that goes into a ramp, which then goes into the colour node. Now traditionally people use this and put it into the incandescence, but what I find is then that blows out the whole image and you end up with lighting in the darker areas or in the shadow areas which you don't necessarily want. If I just bring up the attributes on this, so you can see the ramp, so it just goes into the colour channel, and this is all we have. We have our skin colour here, and we have our the ramp, or the colour that we want our rim light here. Now you can obviously pipe a texture into this as well, like we have done with the dress, etc. But that's basically how it's set up. Now, like I say, I'm trying to be as general as I can be without going into specifics. And as you can see, I've added it to all the objects. They've all got their own colours, their own amounts of how much the rim is going to affect each model. Just close that down. You'll also notice I've added this red plane here, and that is so the final gather will bounce off the bottom here, the ambient occlusion, and it will reflect a red light up under the rocks. Again, this is just an experiment, so right, again, I'll render this and then we can compare and we'll see how it looks. So here she is with the fake rim lighting applied, and as you can see, it's picked out a lot of the details around her arm here, and particularly the snails as well. If I just zoom in, you can see it's just picked up these lines around the edges of them and just brought them out of the image a little bit more. If I compare it with how it was before, you can see the rim lighting has just brightened everything up, and like I said, all these details are just popping out of the image now. I'll just flick between the two again. And also that red plane underneath has just added this red touch underneath here. Now it's important to remember that this is not the final render. This is it done. We're going to print it out and it's finished. This is just giving us the foundations to build upon. What we're going to do in the next stage is we'll take all our various render passes and combine them and then play around with them to add more depth to the image, add more texture, and just give it a lot more contrast, vibrancy, and just make it look a lot more interesting. What you have here, I go right back to the beginning, so we've basically gone from this, which was our default light, added in our key light which gave us our shadow, added in some ambient occlusion to brighten up the image a little bit and give us some subtle depth and globally light the scene. And then we've added the rim lighting in, which has just brought out all the elements and just highlighted them in a way, and it's also given more depth to the image, and it's given it a more cartoony illustrative feel too. So from here to here, just by playing around with the lighting and adding in a few quick shader tricks. So like I say, what you need to do now is play around with the shaders to get all the skin tones, the stones, the right colours, even play around with the gradient in the background until you're completely happy with how the scene is looking, and then from there it's a case of rendering out various render passes. Now each application does this in their own different way, but you essentially just want to set up a batch render. You want your main diffuse, which is just your base colours and textures, and then you want to render out an ambient occlusion pass, perhaps a shadow pass as well, reflection pass because we've got reflections in her eyes and in the snail's eyes, and also strip down the shaders and render out a pass just with the rim lighting, so you just get the rim lighting on a black background. And again, we can take this into Photoshop. I keep saying Photoshop, but whatever application you're going to use, and overlay that. And what we can do with that then is, if there are any elements which we want to increase the rim lighting, like say around the face here, it's not as bright as we maybe want, we can use that layer to then just increase that on its own without editing anything else. One other pass that you need to render out is a selection pass, and I will show you that in the next video, but that is basically just every object with a different colour shader on, rendered out flat with no lighting information, and this just makes it easier for you to just select elements separately so that you can play around with the colours, the contrast, etc. Without affecting anything else. Like I say, I'll go over that in the next lesson. But for now, play around with the colours, the background and everything, the room lighting, and when you're happy, render out all your render passes, and we'll play around with those next. So you've rendered out all your various render passes and you've brought them into Photoshop or whatever painting package you're going to be using for this tutorial. And you should be looking at something like this. Now obviously I've brought in things in different layers, and I've used a mask just to cut out and separate the foreground from the background. As you can see with this layer, which is the main Master Beauty render pass, I've just chopped that out so it can hover over the front of the background, and this gives us more flexibility so we can change the background colour and do other things. Like here I have the clouds as a separate layer, so I can move those around if I want to, and I've also blurred them slightly so they're out of focus. So this is what we're looking at the moment. The render looks okay, there's nothing drastically wrong with it. It does need a bit more contrast and a bit more depth though, and also the colours need playing around with, and we could also add in a bit more detail if we wanted to. First, let's have a quick look at the various render passes that I've put into this file for you. So we'll just turn off this and turn off the background for now. So working our way from the bottom, we have our utility maps. Now these are maps which help us work on the overall image. They don't actually add to the image, they just help us as we're working. So obviously we have our mask, which we've been using to help cut out all the other elements, separating the foreground from the background. We have our depth channel, which just gives us the Z depth information. Our selection mask, as I mentioned previously, this just allows us to quickly go in and say, right, if I just select that layer, I'm going to select the hair like so, and then I can tweak it on another layer. As you saw there, if I try and select the hair on a different layer, you end up having to select different little bits, and it can get quite complicated. The selection mask just makes selecting separate elements so much easier. And the diffuse here, this is just the basic diffuse texture rendered out. I'm not sure what I'm going to use this for yet, but it's always handy to have it there. And just as a top tip, render out more render passes than you need, and it's just going to give you more flexibility when you come to do this compositing section. We have our background maps here, which is just the gradient and the clouds. I have these others here which I will go over shortly. We have this is our Master Beauty, which is just like doing a normal render. It gives you everything baked into one map. What we have here is the beauty again, but without any reflections in the eyes, and that is so we can overlay the reflections later and just soften them a bit just by blurring them. Detail maps, if I just turn on this beauty and we'll turn on the background again, this will allow us to see the difference as we work. In here, if I turn this on, now we have the reflection as I mentioned, and this will just overlay, and what we'll do with that is set that to screen like so, and there we've got our reflections back into the eyes. Scatter was that subsurface scattering information. Now it's very subtle here, but again we'll apply a screen. If I turn it on and off, it's very subtle, but it just adds that little bit of hint of a subsurface scattering to the skin. And the specular map, again this is just going to come in and highlight all those shiny parts. Again we'll try a screen with that. As you can see, it's just brought those out of the image and made them a bit shinier. So already, if we compare that with our Master Beauty, it's already looking, well, it's just looking better just by having those separate layers and overlaying them separately in Photoshop. So next we have our light maps. So we have our rim lighting layer. Turn off that master beauty. There we go. All this is just the rim lighting information. Again, we can add another screen to that, which will just get rid of the black background and leave us with the colour. And again, that is just bringing out those rim lighting sections for us. Now we have two shadows here. We have shadow raw and just a normal shadow. And you see the shadow raw is just a little bit more intense, and that's the one I tend to go with. Now for this, we don't want to use a screen because, as you can see, it'll leave the shadow white. Instead, we want to set that to subtract, and that will take that information out of the image. And again, it's just given us more depth because it's enhanced the shadows. And now we can start playing around with the opacity. Maybe we only want the shadows maybe 30%, just to give that little bit more depth. And finally, we have the occlusion map. Again, this is just a basic occlusion map, and we're just going to set that to overlay, like so. Now that is too much because it's blowing out a lot of the white areas, so we can just reduce that to maybe 50%, and that'll give us that extra depth to the scene. As you can see, under her skirt here is nicely shadowed, and it's just making everything seem and feel a lot more 3D. So those are our main render passes, and you can go in and you can play around with all those as much as you like, tweaking them, adjust the opacity, etc., until you get the sort of image and the sort of colour balance and feel that you need. What we can do next is go in, and as I already have here, and apply some colour tweaks. If I just turn these off. So you'll see I've just done an auto levels, and that just again adjusts the contrast and the levels, the colour levels and balance in the scene. And here I've added in a hair layer, and again this is just using our utility map. We'll just zoom into the hair. So with that layer selected, let's say we want to make the hair a different colour. Select the hair using the selection map, and then we can go in and create a hue saturation adjustment layer. And now we can adjust this. I'll just move that up so we can actually see it. There we go. Want the hair red, purple, and we can adjust that independently, like so. And we can turn it on and off, and that's only affecting the hair. And the same can be done with anything. With your selection mask, we could change the colour of the dress, we could change the colour of her eyes and of the grass, or anything else really. So that's just a quick way of adjusting colours. You can adjust the contrast or anything using your selection mask. So here are my layers. What I've done is I've just tried to break up the stones a little bit, as you can see, and also adjusted the colour on the shell and on the hair. These are just subtle changes, but they do help to enhance the overall image. So I'll delete that layer for now because we're not using it. So you've gone in, you've applied all your different layers, you've tweaked the colours, adjusted the shaders, etc., and you're getting an image that you're more happy with. You can also adjust the background as well. Now this is our original background which we had in, but I wanted to play around a bit more, just add in a few extra passes. Again, these are just textures that I've found on the internet or I've drawn and just brought them in and overlaid them as separate layers. So again, it's just adding a bit more detail in the background, but not detracting too much from the character in the foreground. So you may be looking at this and thinking, alright, well we're pretty much done there. Let's flatten those layers and save it out, and job done. Well, you can go even further and I'll demonstrate this with the rocks. You'll notice in detail maps I've added a texture folder. If I turn that on, you'll see that I've just overlaid some textures onto the stones just to give them a bit more detail. And again, I've done the same with the wood and with the snails, just to give them a bit more detail, really. If I turn off all these, because I did all the stones separate, so you don't just end up with one texture pasted over the top, and what you'll find is you'll get the texture bleeding between the stones, and you don't want that, because then it just breaks up the illusion. So if I go back to my stone layer, so the first one, set it to normal, 100%. As you can see, it's just a texture over the top, and then you play around with your blending modes, and then just adjust them to suit what you want. And again, we're getting to the stage now where it's all about personal taste. You might not want this texture, you might want something else. You might like the rocks the way they were. You may want the rocks a different colour, so use your selection mask, go in and change those colours. It's as easy as that now. And having all those render passes, having all these different elements in these folders, it may seem a lot, but it's just giving you much more freedom. And if I demonstrate, if we bring back our Master Beauty, which was the original render that we did in Maya, or whatever package that you want to use. So here is how it was originally, and with us playing around with it, we've enhanced it this much. Now it's got a lot more contrast, a lot more detail, and to be honest, just doing that was just a 10-minute job, maybe half an hour at the most. So take your time, spend a full day on playing around with this, because it's going to be the final image until you are absolutely spot on happy with it. One thing we didn't do, and that was adjust the reflections. If I go into detail maps, reflection, and all we want to do, because this is a separate layer, we can just go in, filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and just soften those. They're a bit too sharp at the moment. Just bring this down. So we can just soften those on that layer, and it's not going to affect anything else. So that is basically where we're at now. We're playing around with the colours, we're adding texture and a lot more detail to this scene until we are happy with how it's looking. Now what I would recommend is get to the stage where you think you're happy with it, save it out and walk away. Come back the next day, or maybe leave it a day and then come back with fresh eyes, and then you will no doubt see areas where you want to change, some things don't work, or something like that. Now that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to leave this as it is here, and I'm going to come back to it later, do a bit more work on it, so the image that you'll see in the magazine may be slightly different to this one, so don't worry too much. I've shown you the whole process of how we've got to this stage, and from here on it's up to you to just play around with it. Like I say, you might want it to have blonde hair and a blue dress. You can easily change that now, you know how, with the selection mask. So let's say we're happy, we've completed work on this. What we need to do now is add a bit of depth of field. If we go back to our utility maps, you remember I had a depth map down here. Let's just turn these off so we can see it. Right, we're going to use this to help give us a bit of a sense of depth of field. Now first of all, we need to select it, copy it, and we'll paste it into our alpha channel, like so. And then we're going to go image adjust, we're going to invert it. Because the way Photoshop works, like say if you're using a different package, it may be different. Black, the darker the colour, the sharper the image, the lighter the colour, the more blurred. So in this case, white will be completely blurred, and that's fine because that's the clouds in the background, and as it gets darker it comes more into focus. So we've got that in our alpha channel. So let's turn that off. Let's bring back all our main images like so, and we're just going to flatten that image. Now we're going to go to filter, blur, where is it? Lens blur. Right, I just need to shrink this down. Zoom out a bit. And as you can see there, it's already using the alpha. If I turn down this blur focal distance, turn down the radius, so this is it with no blur, and all we're doing is saying use the texture in the alpha, and we adjust the radius, and that will make the background more blurred. If I turn it right up, you'll see this is more in focus, and as we get deeper into the image, that's getting more and more blurred. So we need to reduce that because we only want a subtle blur, something like that. But the problem is this is in focus and this isn't as in focus as we want. And this is where this comes in. We can actually push the focal point back slightly. Now I know I said I didn't want to get into specifics on each application, but this is quite an important part of the stage of this process. So you'll just have to bear with me for this one lapse where I'm actually showing actual tools. So we can push that back. So this is more in focus, and then maybe turn up the radius a bit more. As a rule of thumb, people are naturally drawn to the eyes. So if we try and keep the eyes in focus, then that should be our main focal point. So let's say we're happy with that, we've tweaked it. Click OK, and that applies that it's a very subtle blur, but it just helps to add a bit more depth to the image. So I think we've come to the end of the tutorial now. We've gone through modeling, UVing, texturing, lighting, rendering, render passes, and compositing now, as well as tweaking and playing around and adding more depth and texture to the image. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you've learned a lot from it. I've certainly enjoyed doing it. If you want to see any more of my tutorials or my work, please feel free to visit my website and also check out my tutorials for 3D World and also for digital tutors.